Hello, everyone. I'm Sandy Rosenthal, and I'm so excited to have my guest today, Mr. Sam Pratt, who led a 7-year battle to stop the construction of a massive coal-burning cement plant that would have completely overwhelmed the town of people who live there in the city of Hudson, with a population of just 7,500. Good morning, Mr. Sam Pratt. How are you today?
Good morning, Sandy. I'm
So
well.
it's so good to have you. Mr. Pratt is a journalist and designer and activist who lives in New York's Hudson Valley. He does graphic design and websites. He's been featured in Esquire, Media Week, New York Magazine, and others too. He's organized a lot of political campaigns and led several successful environmental challenges to major industrial projects. But the most notable one is this cement plant that we're going to talk a lot about today. And after today's show, I really encourage our listeners to look up an amazing story about Sam's battle that was published in our town. The name of the story is We Dodged a Bullet. I highly encourage you to take a look at it. You'll be as amazed as I am when you take a look at what this gentleman has done and the effort that he led. I highly recommend it. But before we get into that battle and how you did it, I want to talk for just a moment about something I saw on your Facebook page that was just a few weeks ago. I understand a young dog got out of his yard, and the older dog, a pit bull, was worried about the younger dog and followed him as he got out into the streets and somehow managed to make it to your property. And most people would have just let those dogs keep going, but not you. You lured them onto your deck, looked at their rabies tags, and managed to find call their vet and then find their owners. So can you elaborate on that? I think that's a lovely story.
Well, I live at the end of, it's funny, you should mention, I live at the end of a dead end road, dirt road, really in the middle of nowhere, at least for New York State. And these dogs, as it turned out, had walked about 2 miles on a hot spring day. And it took quite I saw them coming down the road. I said hello. They seemed to be friendly. But it took quite a long time of kind of chasing them around the neighborhood to eventually get them onto my deck. And luckily, they had all kinds of tags on them, but they didn't lead me to the owner. I had to find their veterinarian, who sent me to another veterinarian, and it was a long saga. But I love animals, and I couldn't imagine. We got a lot of coyotes and other things here, and those are someone's pets. Why
Oh,
I
of
couldn't
course.
possibly just say not my problem.
Anything could have happened to those dogs. And in my mind, that says a lot about the kind of person that you are, that you care. And today it's the dogs, tomorrow it's saving a town from a cement plant.
Well, I would
And
hope that anybody else would do the same, but thank you.
yeah, I'm afraid a lot of people would have not. So I thank you. I'm sure the owner thanks you. And again, it tells us a lot about the sort of person you are. So Sam led a battle and won, and he did a lot of things right. And we could talk about so many things that he did, but what I'd like to focus on today is is Sam understood the need to create a base of supporters. No one can do anything alone. And you shouldn't try to do something alone, because then it becomes about you. But once you've created that base of support, that's when things can happen. And I'm not saying you need to create 100,000 supporters or even 100 supporters. Uh, you need to start out with a base, and you understood that right from the get-go. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that right now.
Okay.
Sure.
Well, just briefly to tell you about the project, we woke up one day. This was in the end of 1998, believe it or not. The battle went on so long that it wore on for about 7 years. But we woke up one day to the news that the largest cement manufacturer in the world, one of their divisions, was proposing a truly massive coal-fired cement plant, which would have sprawled over 2,000 acres in two towns, actually, both the town of Hudson and Greenport. And this is not a little concrete batching place where you go to get a few yards of cement to pour a new deck or like that. This is crushing millions and millions of tons of limestone down to powder by burning it in a gigantic 400 foot kiln with about 20 industrial buildings of 200 feet or larger, an 1,800-acre quarry, a massive barge facility, et cetera, et cetera.
It
And
sounds
this
like
was,
something out of Gotham City.
yeah, and this is a very rural area right near the Hudson River, which is a national heritage river. Um, and we were told that this project was a slam dunk. All of our local politicians, as well as our state reps and our congressmen, all supported it from the get-go. They had all been extensively lobbied before we heard even the first word about it. And we were told that it was going to bring all kinds of jobs to the community and be a great thing. And what did I know about cement manufacturing? Nothing. I was a journalist, minding my own business in the town where I lived. But the more we looked into it, the more we realized that this is a company that turns towns into ghost towns. They have projects all over the country, all over the world, where literally the neighboring town just basically, disappears because it's intolerable to live near these places, or the people who are stuck there wind up with all kinds of terrible health problems.
I wouldn't be surprised if the people bringing this to your town even tried to tell you it was good for you, that it was healthy
Oh,
to have.
absolutely.
It's that was a guess. They really did try to tell you that.
Oh, absolutely. No, one of their slogans was that we're going to make the air cleaner by burning 500 million pounds of coal right next to it. And these companies, these cement manufacturers, also now love to use what they call alternative fuels, which is their euphemism for burning tires and hazardous waste as fuel. And they love it because they get paid to burn these things by other people rather than having to buy coal. And of course, they said, oh, it's going to use state-of-the-art technology, which turned out not to be state-of-the-art. And um, anyway, the more we looked into it, the more we realized this is a problem. And we didn't immediately say we're opposed to it. We said, we meaning me and about 15 other people.
That it was exactly what I was going to ask. So we're talking about 15 people to start.
Right. We had a small group of people who had fought a hazardous waste processing plant shortly before this came up. So we had a little bit of a proto group, but it had essentially disbanded after we won that other fight. And so a lot of the same people came together when we first heard about this.
So there already was a small base, a
very small base. But again, we're talking a dozen and a half people who had worked together on various local issues, but under a completely unincorporated. We had no particular status. We had no office. It was just we had called ourselves Friends of Hudson, and just to have a name. But it really was just my living room, essentially.
And I really think this is important for our listeners. It's people tend to give up too quickly when they think, well, I don't have, hundreds of supporters. You don't have to have those things. You can start out with just a dozen and a living room and a card table. Anyway,
Absolutely.
Go on.
Yep. But it's really important to emphasize that you've got to keep growing a group, at least when you're dealing with an adversary the size that we were. The company ended up spending $60 million in our tiny little town of, about 7,000 people over the period of 7 years. And, we were delighted when we raised our first $100. We ended up having to raise about $2.5 million and get 30 other groups involved to stop these guys.
And that's still a whole nother story for another podcast. I look forward to having you back on.
But as far as, how did we grow the group and how did we sort of pull it together, if that's the question?
It's first of all, it's the importance of having a base of support, and you couldn't have done it alone. I mean, Sam Pratt, as wonderful as you are and as good-hearted, you couldn't have done it alone.
Right. We had to identify, how do we stop it? Is it going to be legally? Is it going to be politically? Is it going to be through the media? It turned out to be all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
But unless you have, an organized, vocal group of people that decision makers will take seriously,
Mm-hmm.
they can just blow you off. And
Right.
they will, even when, I remember when we reached 1,000 petition signatures, the chairman of our board of supervisors just scoffed. I don't think he'd ever gotten a petition of 1,000 signatures before in his life, but he said, well, we've got 60,000 people in our county. That's only 1,000. And so that was, then we
That was
went years
mistake
and
number
years.
one.
Yeah,
Mistake number one. He scoffed at 1,000 petition signatures. But let's
yeah,
pull back for just a moment. And
sure,
there's a lot of our listeners see a problem in their town and community and feel like there's nothing they can do.
right,
Today we're going to empower them. Yes, there is something you can do. Now,
right.
in your case, you started out with about a dozen people that had already were bound
Hmm.
by a previous mission or goal that you had accomplished.
Right.
Do I have that correctly? So you
Yeah,
started out with a
exactly.
dozen.
It was totally ad hoc. And, I always go back to the advice that the labor organizer Cesar Chavez once gave to somebody, at least reputedly. The way I heard it was someone that said to him, well, how do you go about organizing? What's your big secret? He was very effective in California and other places in getting farm workers, to stand up for their rights. And Chavez apparently said, well, I talked to one person and then I talked to another person.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Mm-hmm.
person asking the question said, so what do you mean? He said, I mean just that. I talked to one person and then I talked to another person. And really what we did was we tried to leverage every contact we made. If I met
Mm-hmm.
you, if you lived in Hudson and I met you and you had heard about this and you said, oh my God, and what is this thing? I'm very concerned, and we had a good conversation. The first thing I would do is I would say, Sandy, could you have your three best friends over for coffee like tomorrow? Doesn't need to be a big production. You don't have to put on a giant spread. I'll bring some donuts and bagels or whatever. And let's talk it out with them. Bring my friend Peter, who's helping me with this, and we'll talk. And we just literally went at it like that. There was no meeting we wouldn't take. There was no meeting that was too small. And that was how we got from a dozen to 100,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually to 1,000 to 4,000 to 16,000 petitions signers, to beating the largest cement company in the world. Now, there was a lot of things that developed over time that allowed us to greatly augment that. So it wasn't just me and Peter, you know, having coffee and donuts with people, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. But it really began just with that face-to-face interaction. And, at the time, social media didn't really exist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I almost, it, I almost think it was a blessing that it didn't, because it forced us to, have more non-virtual contact.
Mm-hmm.
We did develop a very active email listserv that became very useful for our core members to share information. Not everybody wanted that much information about it, but it's those face-to-face contacts and just saying, you know, I'll come over to your house, give me your address book, I'll
Mm-hmm.
bring 20 flyers, we'll stuff the envelopes with bumper stickers. And if I send the information to them cold, it's junk mail. If Sandy, who they know and love, puts her name on the envelope and writes a personal note and says, I'm getting involved with this, I really hope you will too, then we've got a shot at capturing some more of those
I
people.
think you've just touched on a very, very key point, and I'd like to grind that in a little bit for our listeners. You noticed Mr. Pratt and myself and my work, we didn't do what we called a cold call. We talked to people we knew.
Yeah,
And then we asked them to talk to people that they knew. And
yeah,
then, but you have to ask them to do that. That's another thing. You
yeah,
can't just assume they're going to talk to their mom and dad and sister and family and friends. You have to ask them to. And
right.
some people are just waiting to be told what to do. A lot of people are waiting
Hmm.
for instruction. Uh, I'm sure some people came to you and said, Sam, how can I help you with
Right.
this effort? But I have a feeling more of your efforts were going to other people and giving them crystal clear language. If you care about your town, you need to do this, and then tell them what to do.
Yeah.
Am I
Yeah. I mean,
crystallizing that for you?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think where a lot of activist groups, in my experience, fail is by just saying, well, we got 500 signatures. We submitted it to our mayor, and we lost.
And then they
And
stop.
yeah, and
Yeah.
then they stop. That's just the beginning. I mean, I'll give an example, and
Mhm.
a lot of this falls under the category of what the British have an expression, boring but important. And a lot of the advice I give people when they ask me for it, and I have done some consulting to groups who've gone on to win their own battles, but I say, listen, you're hoping that I'm going to tell you, go find a Native American burial ground on the site and that will kill the project. I said, that never happens. It happens 1 in 1,000 times. The way you're going to win is by doing this really patient, slow, tedious work, but you will win and it'll be the most thrilling thing ever. So an example, I would say, we did, like most groups, begin circulating petitions, which were just essentially calling on our local leaders and agencies to take a harder look at the project. We eventually developed stronger language as we formally opposed it. So we had all these petition signatures, and they were on paper. Again, this was in the late 90s, 2000s. Eventually, we did online petition gathering as well, but we had volunteers, walking the streets, putting clipboards on the counters of local delis and restaurants, and gathering all these signatures. And they would come back in, and we would Xerox them, and we would send them off to our elected officials. But the most important thing about the petitions was I had a volunteer, well, someone who became a volunteer, who came in and said, "What can I do?" And I said, "You know what? We've got all these names on petitions. They're really hard to read. In some cases, it takes 4 tries and going through the phone book. We still had phone books back then, but we need to figure out exactly who all these people are, what their correct address is, and follow up with them so that we can keep them in the loop and give them more things to do. It's like squeezing, every drop out of the lemon. You want them to sign the petition, then you want them to put a bumper sticker on their car, then you want them to put a sign in front of, in their window or in front of their house. Then you want them to write a letter to the editor. Then you want them to, call their local representatives. Then you want them to go up to the state house and sit outside the governor's office.
Well,
Then
this is I think I'd like to step in right now because
yeah,
I have a feeling like, didn't any of your supporters say, "You're asking me to do an awful lot here"?
yeah,
And I mean, you must have had, you mentioned earlier that there was if you sign 500 petitions to your city council person, you feel you're done. And as you and
yeah.
I both know, no, you are not done. You've just gotten started. So what can you tell our listeners who again, our listeners see a problem and they want to do something?
Right.
And so how, I mean, and yes, it does entail giving your supporters things to do, but how do you keep them from getting burned out? How do you
Yeah.
keep them encouraged? What do you say to them to make them feel like, this
Mhm.
is working, this is helping, we are getting somewhere? Because there's bound to be moments where you feel disappointment. Something didn't go as well as you thought it would, or this is taking longer than we thought it would. What would you tell our listeners to encourage them to get through those periods of
Yeah.
okay.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, first of all, just to step back a little bit, I mean, what we try to do is give people menus of things to do. And you sort of had the starter menu. And then as somebody proved that they were someone who really wanted to follow through more, I mean, only a certain percentage of people was going to get through our entire menu, but, you needed it to have it. And some people were just ridiculously intensely involved. And other people too, is a matter of identifying their particular skill. So, you're a great communicator. If you were involved, I might say, Sandy, we really need to hone our message better. Can you help me work on that? And so you would target things to people's specific skills rather than giving them just generic things to do.
Give
And
them
yeah,
choices. You gave them choices. Menu.
yeah,
I really like that.
yeah.
In my work, I used to call it choices, but I love your
Yeah.
menu idea. Give them a
But
menu
but
of
it's
things they can
also,
do.
one of the things that we really found, and we were just making it up as we went along. I mean, I only found really one group, Lois Gibbs' organization, the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, was pretty much the only group I put a distress call into that actually responded with useful information. And they reminded me that you got to keep it fun for people too. I mean, there's a certain amount of, you can keep people involved to a certain extent by just re-emphasizing, how outrageous the situation is. And the company certainly, and our local politicians helped us out a lot with that by just misbehaving nonstop. Uh, and so that allowed people, that always gave us another jolt of energy. I mean, the company, would send out the most ham-handed flyers. They were saturating our community, and not just our town, but all the neighboring towns, and eventually towns in the neighboring states that we got involved with flyers and radio ads and TV ads. And they were terribly done, but they were everywhere. They had a full page ad in our local paper almost every day, and they had a full page ad in the largest regional paper every week. And these papers were very supportive of them because they were making a lot of money.
I'd like to
So
point, if I
yeah,
interject real quick, hold that thought, but real quick for our listeners, you notice the cement plant had lots of money to throw at this, but they were doing a really bad job of
yeah,
using
thankfully,
all that money. So what good is a lot of money if they do a bad job using it? So anyway, that's all I wanted to point out.
yeah,
So don't
yeah,
be frightened by a problem in your community where you feel
yeah,
they have a lot of money and you don't. So
yeah.
anyway,
So
great
speaking of
point, Sam.
both fun and also the way to counter corporate money. So one of the things they did early on was they printed up a lot of t-shirts and a lot of signs with their logos on it, saying support the plant. And they would just kind of distribute them willy-nilly. They would even put them on people's lawns without even asking them, which actually helped us.
Wow.
But we said, we're a small group. We need to emphasize the fact that they're from Switzerland. Their billionaire owners have never been, it was two brothers who literally at the time were both among the 100 richest men in the world. I think time has passed them by a little bit, but they're still rich. But they had never been to Hudson. They'd never would set foot
Mm-hmm.
there.
Mm-hmm.
And so we wanted to emphasize that we live here. This is our place.
Mm-hmm.
We're local. So we said we need signs, but we're not going to go straight to a printer and just do, their signs are blue and ours are going to be red. So I
Mm-hmm.
found a member who had a big empty barn with a lot of scrap wood in it, and we did a sign painting party. And we'd identified people who either were just willing to try or were artists or had some talent, and we went and we had a party and we all
And you
made
made
our
it
own
fun.
sign. We
And you
made it
made it fun.
fun, and then people could, with some pride, put up their own sign there. And and then when you saw the sign, you saw, oh, that's made by a real person who's one of my neighbors,
Uh-huh.
not some Swiss company that's just putting out this slick advertisements. So we tried to play up that contrast. I mean, eventually the group grew so large that we had to print signs, but we kept making some of our own signs. So we would have them, we would use them as auction items and things like that to raise money. Over time we got to that point, but early on, it was just like, let's get the word out there. Now,
If I could just jump in
to
for
give
a
an
moment, we're talking
yeah,
about how
please.
this is making it
Yeah,
fun and getting back to the core reason this podcast exists is the listeners out there have identified a problem and they want to fix it, and having to identify and work with problems can in all by itself be upsetting and and stressful, and so your job as leading this effort is to do exactly what Sam just said, come up with ways to make this battle fun. And
yeah,
I think that is absolutely critical to keeping a good energy to be able to keep moving forward. And if we could, before we end, I'd love to know what little tricks and tools you can share. If you have any more tricks to grow that database. You did already talk about how ask your friends and ask your mother and that's your cousins. Can you suggest anything else to our listeners? How to grow the
yeah.
database when you're first starting out.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you literally have to have a database. It's really important. And that was something I knew how to do. And, if you were one of our members, I could know whether you had gotten a bumper sticker, whether you'd gotten a sign, whether you'd written a letter, how far down our menu you had gotten,
Uh huh.
all the way, and maintaining a really robust, essentially intelligence on your own members and also the people that you're aiming to grow the group to is critical.
That's
But
really good advice. So, what did you use when you started out? You
I
probably
was
didn't use
using,
the things we have today.
yeah,
Yeah.
nowadays it would probably be an online database like Constant Contact or something like that. But I was using
Mm-hmm.
FileMaker, which
Mm-hmm.
was a program I was familiar with. But shoot, I just lost my thought. A very specific thing. that
Well,
we
we'll
did.
definitely get back to it, and I'm going
Yeah.
to add on to what you said. Nowadays, there's a very good program out there called Mailchimp that's easy to
Yes.
use. You
Yep.
don't need to be a big time tech to be
Right.
able to figure out Mailchimp. And in addition, Mailchimp, which is free, has a feature on it that you can create a website. And again, it's easy. And
Yeah.
if you hear me say it's easy, you know it's easy. I'm 64 years old. I wasn't raised on a computer keyboard like my children
Hmm.
were. And there are cheap, easy to use tools out there right now that you can use to start your database. And even if it's just 10 people to start out, this is something that you should consider using. When your
Yeah.
database gets to thousands and thousands, then you pay, even then you pay of just a very, very small fee. So anyway, do
I,
you remember what that point was
yeah,
that
I
you,
did, but I also
good,
recommend
good, good,
MailChimp. I
good.
have used that. Uh, so the one of the things I discovered, I tried it once and it worked so well. I discovered that people love filling out surveys. I was surprised. I created a membership survey, because I kind of wanted to find out more about, okay, now as we're growing,
Hmm.
we're getting more and more members in that I don't know as much about as, say, the first 100, 200 members, I knew everything about all of them. As we grew into the thousands, it was becoming, I was more distant. I would still be trying to get to know them face to face, but um, and so I created a membership survey
Mhm.
to get more information from them,
Which
asking things.
program did you use, Sam, to build that survey? Do you remember?
It was a piece of paper.
A piece of
Um,
paper. Okay. And now they have
it
Survey
was Xerox,
Monkey
so
for
we
things
would,
like
yeah,
this.
yeah. But now you would do it online probably, but I literally, I designed a 2-page. Well, it was mainly 1 page with room on the back to add more, but saying essentially, who are you and what do you like to do? Why are you involved? What are your skills? What are your biggest concerns, et cetera, et cetera? And all of that went into our database. And then I could say, for instance, we were working to get the Hudson Teachers Union to come out against the plant, but I knew some teachers and I was working with them to spread the word. But, I found out that we had a lot more teachers than I even knew in our group. We had a big effort with doctors. And again, the more I could find out what someone's specific concerns were and what their skills were, the more I could actually give them something to do that really helped.
And then that network ballooned into more networks. That's
Right,
that's brilliant.
right.
And this is really, really, really key. So now this one you found kind of by accident, but it's good to
Yeah,
be looking for those. Good to be keeping an eye out, looking for people who have a big network, who have
right.
people that normally will listen to them.
Yeah.
Recently, I kicked off a petition here in New Orleans just last week, in the tennis community. And what
Mhm.
I did is I sent an email to all the captains of all the tennis teams who are accustomed to disseminating information to their lambs, to their
Right,
flock. So,
right.
that's just a small example, and I don't want to get into that. Today, we're talking about you. So this has been amazing, excellent advice, and you are knowledgeable in so many other things as well. But today we focused on one thing, and that is building your support base. Is there anything
Right.
else, Sam, that you'd like to add for our listeners today? Because I'm afraid we're about running out of time.
Yeah, I mean, quickly, I've got one quick story about signs. One of the things you have to overcome is that people have a lot of reasons why they don't want to be visible or they don't want to be, on the record as having a position. They're afraid that they're going to be punished by local government. Their tax assessment will be increased, or their brother who works for, in town hall will lose his job, et cetera, et cetera. And so overcoming those fears is another big part, especially early on. So as we were making these signs and starting to print them, there was a certain hesitancy, except among the core group, like, am I going to get a rock thrown through my window? We really felt like we were in the minority. And the way that we really got past that was I started thinking about, well, where do we have the densest concentration of members? And it was where their houses are very visible. And there was this one road entering Hudson where I realized I've got like 8 or 10 members right on this major entrance to Hudson. Rather than scattershot trying to get everybody to put up a sign, I'm going to get those 8 or 10 members to all do it in their neighborhood. And I can go to them and say, if we all do it here, they can't throw a rock through all of our windows. And if they
That's
do,
brilliant.
we'll help each other. So then once I was able to get this little narrow corridor with just 8 or 10 families to do it, everybody saw it and they said, "Oh, look, I'm seeing signs." They would say, "I'm seeing signs everywhere." And I'm thinking,
Everywhere.
"No,
They're
actually, you're
everywhere.
only seeing them in one place, really." But they started saying, "I'm seeing them everywhere. Where can I get one?" And we just got right past it. So it's little tricks that you learn, just by trial and error, that I think can really help. And I've got a few more of those if we do this again. But you got to be on the out. When you encounter an obstacle like that, people say, "Oh, I'm afraid to put up a sign." Be creative about, well, how can we get us past this specific?
And we're going to devote another episode to exactly that. How do you talk to someone who's fear of retaliation, of fear of criticism? I mean, and we'll have another episode devoted exactly to that. And I hope to have you on for that. But
Great.
that was brilliant. I love that idea of you've got that street. And I remember reading about that in this story in our town. And again, I encourage all of our listeners to Google the bullet we dodged in our town, and this story comes up, which it's got all the makings for an entire book, but it's condensed into a very reasonably readable short thing. I highly encourage everybody to take a look at that. And I know you'll enjoy it as much as I did. I so enjoyed
Great.
having you on,
Me
Sam. I
too.
wish we could
Thanks for
talk
having
all
me.
day, but
Yeah,
that's it
another
for
time.
today. So thank you again, Sam Pratt, for joining me. And I hope all of you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. And remember, no matter who you are, you can beat the big guys.
Thanks, Sandy.
Thanks so much.
Great.
Okay.
All right.
The little
Well,
jingle comes on.
yeah, you can